We have Jun Axup, the Chief Scientific Officer of IndieBio and partner at IndieBio, on our inaugural What Makes a Successful Biotech Startup session. Jun has seen 136 startups come through IndieBio. She has a PhD from the Scripps Institute in Chemical Biology. She is a two-time founder herself, so she's walked the walk. And she's just one of the smartest people I know. I still remember the day I met her, December 2016, and it's just been a huge gift in my life. She's taught me more things than anyone else. It's a great pleasure to have you on the first session. So,
thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. So, given you've seen so many startups and IndieBio has been extremely successful, I've invested in two of your companies, and the number of companies that have gone on to raise $100 million has been, I think there's been over a dozen that have raised huge rounds. What have you seen that are the similarities between companies that were successful in their raise versus ones that weren't?
Yeah, absolutely. So at IndieBio, we're a startup accelerator. We've been around for 5 years and invested in over 136 companies at the moment. They've gone on and have over $2 billion of enterprise value at this point. And the questions that we look at when we evaluate companies boils down to 5 things. The first thing is, what is the technical advantage that they have that creates an unfair advantage in the marketplace? So of course, this is the IP, this is the true science of it. And so we invest in biotech. So of course, most of these companies will have some kind of hard science and wet science. Some are computational, some are hardware focused. And from that, we look at what is the product that they're making from the science, because the science itself obviously is not a product. They have to build that into a product. And then figuring out how that creates a sustainable business. And then, of course, the bigger VC question is this impactful? So our rough gauge is, does this affect 1 billion people or can potentially make $1 billion in the future? So of course, looking at big impact things. But I would say the one thing that actually is the most important around founding startups is, who are the people? Yeah. And are these the people and this team the ones to actually carry out this vision and create this product and build this company? As we know, ideas are a dime a dozen. It's all about execution, and ultimately the execution is who these people are. Mm-hmm. So I would say that our founders are a little bit different from your traditional profile. I think traditionally, a lot of times you have kind of the entrepreneurship type person, or oftentimes a business person, commercializing something that comes from a scientific lab. We actually really encourage scientists themselves to become the entrepreneurs. And the reason for that, there's a couple of different reasons. One is that most PhDs going into their PhD think that they want to become a professor, and then eventually realize that there actually aren't that many professorship positions out in the world. And so now they have to either go to industry, take on jobs that they may or may not have wanted to do to begin with. And so entrepreneurship is kind of an alternative path to say, you can essentially build your own lab, but in the context of a startup, building a product. And this is also very, very attractive, because I think a lot of scientists themselves are really frustrated, saying that, I work 7 years and all I get is this paper that then nobody reads, right? They actually want to be the ones to be like, okay, I've built this thing. I want to see it in the hands of someone and changing someone's life. Yeah. And so there's a lot of motivation there too for scientists to want to do this themselves. And so that's the drive that we've seen. And we actually think that scientists are really great at becoming entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurship is essentially testing hypotheses, building that thing as cheaply, as fast as you can, finding out if it's right or wrong, and most likely it'll be wrong. But if it's wrong, doing that loop again, right? So I think that's the key advantage of a startup compared to bigger companies. As a startup, you're always going to be resource limited, always time limited. But if you can close that loop much faster and do way more iterations than a big company, then that's how you're going to get that trajectory and escape velocity, whatnot, to succeed. So I think scientists actually come with that mindset. Yeah. And I think the one, so that includes, hardworking, quick learning, versatile, resourcely. And then the one I think that's really important is persistence and like the resilience, right? Because, in my PhD, it was like 95% of the time you do something and it doesn't work. And it's that 5% of the time that things do work that kind of keeps you going. But throughout your PhD, you have to like build in that concept of, okay, this setback, isn't personal, and you kind of take a pause, reevaluate the situation, come up with a new hypothesis, and then be excited about trying out that new hypothesis the next day. So in a lot of senses, I think the scientific process is the same as the entrepreneurship process. And so there's a lot of overlap there. So what we've seen is the best founders, first of all, should be a team. Solo founders, it's very, very difficult as a solo founder. Even just like emotionally, it's very hard. And also just having one other person to bounce an idea off of keeps you in check.
100% agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see like the best kind of combo are, the science person who kind of brings the science, and then some kind of hustler type person. The hustler person actually does not need to be like an MBA. Like many of our successful companies, the CEO is actually a PhD scientist themselves. And they're often ones that kind of adapt this hybrid mentality of scientist and a business person. We've seen that to be really successful because there's a couple of different things. One, as a scientist who knows a lot of the fundamental science and can fully understand what's happening in the science, when they're at a business meeting, pitching to a customer, if the customer says, oh, well, can your thing do this and this and this, then you immediately kind of have a little bit that instinct of like whether something's possible or not. So it just makes the conversation flow much better and makes it more adaptable versus being like, oh, wait, I need to go and check with my team, right? So being very, very literate in the science, whether you're a scientist or not, but knowing all the ins and outs is definitely a key. And then we've also found that I think it's really interesting as a scientist becoming entrepreneur, because I think most of our scientists founders are very humble in that they don't know anything about business. And there's that kind of growth mindset, novice mindset, where when you don't know things, you're much more open to trying things and taking in feedback and experimenting. And so in some ways, like that growth mindset is extremely needed, especially in the early days of your company, so that you can keep that naivete a little bit and just experiment. So yeah, we found that to actually be very successful. Not to say like that is the only pattern of success, but that definitely has been a lot of our founders, since they do primarily come from scientific backgrounds.
I've met a number of your founders, and I'll definitely concur that the level of BSing is a lot lower with somebody who has a science background and is switching over to business. And I totally agree with you on the humility. I remember talking to one founder who already had a $1 million sort of pilot program, and he was saying that he had no revenue. And I said, no, that's revenue. That's money in the door, right? And so and I absolutely agree with you. My two favorite words are validation and iteration, and scientists have that in bounds. I also think that the last 5 years there's been a fractionating on the cost of lab, right? And so now you actually have co-working space for a lab, different types of labs. That's making it possible that you don't have to build your own lab from scratch, which used to be very expensive. So if you look at, so I think most of your companies have been very successful. If you look at the few that hasn't been able to raise as big of rounds, what do you think they were lacking? Like if you had a way to give them advice on how to improve the process, what would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess iterating on kind of like the things that were kind of the opposite of what I just mentioned as positive features. Some of the biggest traps, I think, especially as a scientist, is one is not embracing the entrepreneur side. Sometimes if you continue to think like, I am kind of in an academia mindset, or that I will make something and then people will come, right?
Yeah.
That is absolutely the wrong mindset. So that's one thing that we focus on day one in our program, is for people to go out and reach out to customers, to potential customers. And that's the feedback. And, sometimes it's really hard feedback, because this is your baby that you're like putting out into the world, and people are coming back and saying that you have an ugly baby. That's really hard to hear sometimes, but that is something that people have to get over. And I think the people who end up holding onto their baby a little too tight are the ones who don't move as fast. Yeah, I think, one of our observations is that, like, companies don't mainly die actually because of co-founder issues, or that the people give up on something. Occasionally there are ones where the science just doesn't work, and that totally makes sense. And there's occasionally ones where like there's absolutely no business there, and that the business or the regulatory is going to be so much of an inhibition that it's not going to continue. But ultimately it's usually the people decide to give up on that. So we have also seen that, like, even if people are slow to raise, we've seen folks who are so passionate that like maybe a year later they end up raising. And it is also about like, what is the milestones that you have to hit. And for some companies, the milestones are extremely high. For example, therapeutics companies, like most investors would not put money in until they see at least an animal model. So, and then that becomes very difficult capital wise in order to gain the amount of money to do all those models, to be able to present that to investors. So at IndieBio, we're also still experimenting on that to see how better to support therapeutic companies to get to that stage, which is a little more challenging than the most other types of companies. But yeah, I think there's definitely, I think the people who grow faster and have that growth mindset tend to get there faster. Like the more outward facing you are, the better, because both you're building relationships, you're starting to gain a following, you're gaining customer traction, you're just learning constantly to while interfacing with the outside world, versus just kind of be in your own head and try to build something to perfection.
I definitely had the same experience with some founders, which is the hesitation to start talking about your idea and see what people think. I think a good reminder is that even if somebody doesn't like it, you do gain something from that conversation, which is, what parts do they not like, right? And then you can tweak it and then actually go back to them and say, hey, I heard you, I changed my prototype. What do you think now? Right. And that's, most people have to pay for that, for that feedback.
Yeah.
If you can get it for free, definitely do it. I think the second point is that, I think some of your successful founders actually took a year to fundraise after IndieBio. So, the fundraising process can take longer than most founders would expect. It's not 2 weeks. Sometimes it's not even 2 months. So you just sort of have to stay in the game. Any advice on sort of, I think COVID is the topic du jour right now, but I'd rather talk about, how do you stay alive while you're fundraising if it takes you a year and whatnot?
Yeah, I think actually what we've seen a lot is the companies that end up raising after a year oftentimes make some kind of pivot. So that kind of tells you that to begin with, there just might not be a fit. That something about their product market fit wasn't there, potentially, like there might not have been the traction that they want. Like as you're saying before too, that as you get feedback from people, people tend to try to get feedback from their friends, but their friends might not give you the truth. It might be like, oh, this is great. Like, I might be interested in this, right? But that is very different from, whoa, that is amazing. Can I buy it right now? Like, come to my lab, like work with me on this. I will donate my time, right? Like, and that level of engagement, that's when you start to realize like, okay, I'm onto something. People are excited about this, and hopefully you can get multiple people giving that same response.
Yeah.
And same investors, right? Like there are some investors when you talk to and they're like, oh, okay, that's cool. That's great. And then others are like, oh, this is really great. Like, let's set up another meeting tomorrow, and I can get my whole team and on the call, right? So that's also something where essentially you can experiment. Like, every interaction is an experiment.
Exactly.
That's during our program too. It's like we try to get people to like go talk to people, because you're going to just learn so much, and build those relationships at the same time.
Yeah. I guess one of the other questions I had was, how do you, I think a lot of scientists don't have the same rejection training that other types of founders have. How do you speed them through that? Because the program is only 4 months. How do you get their rejection training tolerance? How do you get their thick skin?
Yeah. So I do think that scientists tend to have a little bit thicker skin. And I think people can often pass it off as this is a rejection of this idea, not a rejection of me or like my company, right? So that's actually where we start. So we actually, one of our pillars, I may backtrack, our main pillars of our program, first of all, is the science. Of course, if you have no technology, no science, like there's no company there. And while during the program, we immediately start working on the business, because the business is going to inform the science. And so that iteration between business and science have to be very smooth and constantly talking. And one of the features I love about our lab space is actually we have a glass wall between the lab and the office. And so you can literally see your co-founder working on the other side. And so that really helps to add the momentum between the business and the science connection. We of course work on fundraising and teaching folks like, how do you put together a pitch deck, tell your story, what is structuring a round, how do you make rounds favorable, what is a good deal, and then the last part that we've more recently introduced is a leadership track. And this is, it's often something that is a little bit more down the road, because oftentimes at the moment it's just 2 people in a lab, but the leadership side is really tries to get at the fundamentals. So, some of the things we talk about the first session, I would say, is around purpose. Is we have a whole session about talking about what are people's purposes and why are they building this company that they're doing, and especially having co-founders, be vulnerable to each other about like, what are they here for, right? And that we think, with purpose is kind of your shining star, because you will be beaten over the head many, many times. But at the end of the day, you wake up and it's like, yes, I got knocked down, but that's not going to stop me from fulfilling this purpose, like curing cancer or solving climate change, right? Like, and it's like, okay, even if this one path doesn't work, I'm going to find another way to cure cancer. I'm going to find another way to do it. So that is really grounding, and that's something we try to remind people. It's like, what is the bigger thing that you're looking at? And then from that to, I think, everyone, and I think especially like entrepreneurs, scientists, like there's so much imposter syndrome happening, and there's so many just like pressures, of course, right? And like, am I enough? Am I doing this right? Like, why can't I do this better, right? Like a lot of self-talk and stuff. And so we try to address this very early on, because I think, there's a lot of those things that like happen, and for some people who have done a lot of work on themselves, maybe they realize all these already, but for other people they might not realize some of their initial responses, and that of course lends into the way they conduct their company, the way they interact with their co-founders, the way they interact with investors and partners and stuff. So those are type of grounding things that we try to work on and try to get people aware of during the batch. And then also some things that we try to counsel people on when certain types of events happen. And so people have found it very, very good to, and that's kind of our philosophy too, you know, like leadership comes from the individual first
Yeah.
and from within. And then from that level of peace, can you really exude out and create that change in the world?
I totally agree with you. As someone who only took quant classes or quantitative classes, I literally avoided every sort of touchy-feely class I could all through grad school, and I'm definitely feeling that I needed them. There was one study that said the number one cause for a startup failure is not lack of funding, but founder discourse.
Oh yeah.
And there was a second study that said, the three, or actually, I ended up interviewing a bunch of startups that went all the way to IPO, and the three biggest expenses they cited were real estate at the beginning of the company, were real estate, legal, and employee turnover. And so I think having that strong leadership, which is sort of an all-encompassing word on how you can retain everybody and keep it as a cohesive whole, is going to help you with employee retention as you grow. So I think it's a great track to add.
Yeah.
Last question is, I'm going to dive into the weeds, right? Because biotech can be, you talked about therapeutics, you talked about various different aspects of biotech. It's very diverse. What does product market fit look like for each of the slivers, or however many you want to talk about?
Yeah. Yeah, that's hard. I think everything is different. So I guess, okay, like the easiest ones is, let's say, synthetic biology and
Mhm.
the production of ingredients from microbes. We have quite a bit of a portfolio in food, where a lot of cell-based agriculture, cell-based um, expression of proteins or meats from stem cells and things like that. So that one's kind of easy because it's the end user is the person, and the object gets eaten, and the taste and texture needs to satisfy someone. Um, so yeah, we definitely have companies that are direct to consumer, that where you are trying to satisfy the end user, and whether that is there's, of course, with a lot of these kind of alternative food products, there's a level of philosophy behind it. People like don't necessarily expect it to match to par the existing food product, but because there's also the environmental and lack of antibiotics and use in the development of food product, that there's some give there. A lot of other consumer products, we've had several companies in microbiome space, either things to help your gut microbiome or your skin microbiome. We have one recently that is to help your fertility, and actually based on microbiome and various types of blood tests. So those are kind of your end users. And I think for those companies, it's very much about creating a movement away from factory farming, animal slaughter, away from pollutants and climate change, to better alternatives, not just to satisfy the vegetarians and vegans, but also to go towards the people, anyone who's eating protein, right?
Yeah.
To provide an alternative source. So, and then of course there's the business to business side of things, where some of our companies are making ingredients for other companies, and that becomes very much your end user is the industrial partners. So finding all the both big and small, usually starting out small and then landing big, but also some big companies are really into innovation and scouting out and doing pilot projects with small companies too. So there's lots of opportunity there, and figuring out how to get to the scale and demands and quality and specs that a global player would want. There's definitely so therapeutics, of course, is I would say is a little bit different, because while you figure out your indication and go for and make a specific drug, therapeutics is weird, because essentially you have like a 15-year experiment, right? Yeah. so there it's kind of a tried and true path as well. It's like you need to do the in vivo studies, the toxicology, the mouse studies, the PDPK studies, and then of course eventually get into humans. There's a lot of different business models in therapeutics. The one that is more conducive for venture funding is actually for platforms. If you have a technology that can spin out multiple different leads that solves a certain type of problem, whether it's like delivery or pharmacokinetic problem or something in a particular field, but allows you to potentially partner off assets to different pharma companies in the future, that seems to be most desirable because now you have room to pivot versus putting all your buck behind just one compound. So that becomes hard. And then based on that, you could have multiple different business models. You could decide to go it alone and go for the trials, or your business model could be licensing out compounds to bigger players, or hoping that you get acquired by someone in the meantime. And then all in between, right? Computational companies have different, depending on what kind of markets. Are they doing direct to consumer, genomic testing, for example? Are they doing direct to business and giving pharma data for improving drugs, or are they like selling to hospitals, which is a different way of making a software and having to deploy in those customers. So I think people have found different ways, and I think a part of the product market fit process is understanding who you're actually delivering value to. Like we had a company where they thought they were a B2C company for a while, and then realized that the real value was selling like B2B. And after they made that shift, it actually unlocked capital for them because it became a much better fit than selling B2C. And other companies where you can be an ingredient into someone else's stack, but what if you just did one more thing and made your own? You actually capture all the value there. So so it all like depends, and it's a puzzle, and it is very much that experimentation, right?
Absolutely.
So it's like you're doing business science experiments with the whole hypothesis generation, testing, and reevaluation process.
So from what I've seen is the general advice or the general rule of thumb I've seen is if you're an ingredient to a large buyer, you have to pay attention to the cost of your product a lot more than for consumer. Consumers, are willing to pay 5x for, something that is a trivial amount. But if your end buyer is a large industrial, even if it's a penny more, you might struggle with getting a contract. And the second criteria, other than pricing, is just, I think pre-COVID LOI, letter of intent, was sufficient. But I think what I've seen is a lot of VCs actually want to see a paid pilot. They want to see money in the door, which is a better indication of interest than a letter. So that's just 2 cents from my view. Last question. You talked about platform. So that's definitely a word that's, very, very hot right now. But how do you differentiate a real platform from a company with many products?
That is a really good question. Yeah, and I think that is a huge trap, especially coming from academia, because I think academia kind of overly selects for projects that are kind of a solution without a problem in mind, right? I always like to say that your problem statement is like the very last paragraph of your discussion section in your paper. It's like, this can be used for X, Y, and Z, right? But then it's like, okay, well, does X, Y, and Z actually need this? Or are you trying to just fit this into like some other slot? I think that is very much a challenge. But it's also really hard to say, find a problem and then find a solution to solve it, because if you don't have the technical technical expertise, if you haven't worked on it for many years to gain all the insights on a technology, it's very unlikely that you wake up tomorrow and be like, I've solved climate change, right?
Yeah.
So there is this kind of massaging of matching your problem and the solution. So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, like, I think in like, for example, if you were to make an app, you would definitely go from the problem first, and then the technology is relatively the same, right? You just build the app towards that technology. But when it comes to hard science, it's like, yeah, you kind of start from the grounds and you're trying to aim for
Yeah.
for the top. So the best way to do it is try to go from both sides, and then find where it comes together. And so that only comes from, talking to customers.
Yeah.
And then you realize your customers over here, and then then you start building your technology that way, and then maybe you find another customer and they're over here, and then you start building that way. And so that's kind of like the method, I guess.
Yeah.
The method out there is, again, that experimentation, but really trying to connect your solution and the problem as much as possible. And there's probably going to be lots of pivots and dead ends and whatnot along the way. But if you can do that fast and get to market as fast as possible, then that's how you win.
The one test I use, and it's definitely not a good one, it's not a perfect one at by any means, is, can you get a third party to build on your platform for free, right? So open source is a great example of this, is, and Facebook API was a great example of this as well, is that you don't have to pay anyone and they will build on your platform that benefits your platform as well. That's a platform, right? Whereas if it's just a portfolio of products, nobody really has an incentive to build on addition on top of it. But I'm sure there are exceptions to this rule. It's just every rule of thumb has exceptions. Any last words you want to leave with probably founders or our main audience to this?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about, we're in COVID times, and things are rapidly changing. I think the thing that I've been so humble at and just been like amazed at is just the rally around science right now.
Absolutely.
And yeah. So even though it's been very hard for a lot of companies, having to shut their doors for a while, or potentially force them into pivot or lack of funding, there is still a lot. There's so much in the more general, broader space that people are coming together. People are sharing information more readily, and I'm hoping that this ethos goes beyond COVID. That we start addressing other big problems like that, and hopefully we can put in place new ways of collaboration and methodologies so that we can be stronger in the future. So trying to stay positive in definitely a very hard time for a lot of people, and as with everything, we're always evolving individually. Our society is always evolving, and we just have to find ways to evolve with it.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful message to end on. Thank you, June.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course.